Losing any one of our 4 children is unthinkable. And so you're not going to find me being critical of Mr. or Mrs. Khan, no matter what they do, even if I may disagree with any one particular statement they might make. It's just inappropriate for us in this context to be criticizing them, and I'm not going to participate in that.
This morning, what the press has been speculating about for months finally happened. A Capitol Hill Republican, in this case New York Congressman Richard Hanna, who is not, by the way, running for re-election, announced in an op-ed that he's going to vote for Hillary Clinton, not Donald Trump, in November. That makes him the first GOP member of Congress to cross party lines and say he'll vote for Clinton this year. Then, at the White House this morning, during a joint news conference with the Prime Minister of Singapore, a very non-disinterested figure called Trump woefully unprepared to be president and tried to drive a wedge between the candidate and the GOP officials who've endorsed him.
And the question I think that they have to ask themselves is, if you are repeatedly having to say in very strong terms that what he has said is unacceptable, why are you still endorsing him? This is daily and weekly where they are distancing themselves from statements he's making. There has to be a point at which you say, this is not somebody I can support for President of the United States. The fact that that has not yet happened makes some of these denunciations ring hollow.
But wait, there's more. As if tensions between Trump and his party weren't bad enough, this afternoon, in an extraordinary interview published by the Washington Post, Trump said he's not yet willing to endorse House Speaker Paul Ryan or Arizona Senator John McCain ahead of their respective primary contests later this month. Trump also had some pretty harsh words for New Hampshire Senator Kelly Ayotte, who faces a tough re-election and is one of the most beloved figures in the GOP. John, where did today's events leave Donald Trump's relationship with his own party?
In shambles is where it leaves them. You know, you made the point that that Barack Obama is trying to drive a wedge between Trump and his party. He was doing that. Unnecessary at this point. Donald Trump has said repeatedly and believes he does not care about party unity, and every day the way he behaves, especially today, saying what he said to the Washington Post, everything else he's been doing, suggests that that is what he really believes. He does not think he needs the Republican Party. And increasingly, the Republican Party, watching him, they think he is a threat to their political futures. And as you guys talked about on Morning Joe this morning, there are a lot of conservatives and Republicans who think he is emotionally and mentally unstable and that this is going to be a nightmare from now until November, for them and for him.
President Obama and the Clinton campaign are trying to break the back of the Republican operation right now.
Yep.
They're trying to drive a wedge so strong that Republicans believe they're better off abandoning Trump than running with him. And Trump, rather than trying to fight back and get everybody on board, he loses Christie today partially.
Yep.
Chris Christie's former communications director, announced today she's voting for Hillary Clinton. Right. And for Trump to say he's not supporting necessarily Ryan, he might support his opponent, not to say he's not necessarily supporting McCain. Trump has proven again and again that he just does not like to make nice and turn the other cheek with people who have not been nice to him. Kelly Ayotte has been critical of Trump, to be sure. But any other Republican nominee we've ever seen, any nominee of either party, would be desperate to save that Senate seat.
He doesn't give a damn. He doesn't give a damn about the Republican Party. He doesn't give a damn about these people. And as I said, a lot of them have had deep concerns about him. A lot of them don't think he's a Republican. They don't. They don't think that. And then they prayed that he would kind of behave more like a Republican, that somehow he would, make a pivot. And none of it's happened. And as I say, he's endangering their political futures, and he's acting like a lunatic most of the time. Just today, just for a moment. Today, he lied about the guy who gave him a copy of his Purple Heart. He said this thing about how he wishes he'd won a Purple Heart. In the wake of stories in the New York Times today that have raised the question, opened by the Khan controversy over whether he is a draft dodger, he talks about how he wishes he had a Purple Heart. He takes a guy's Purple Heart, says it's a real Purple Heart. The guy says, actually, it's not a real heart. It's a copy. Again, in a normal candidacy, it would be a huge scandal. In the context of this one, it's just another time when he's lying.
What's that camera number right there?
I don't know.
That's
the camera you look into, that one.
Reince Priebus, meet me at camera 1. You think you've had a hard time dealing with Donald Trump and mediating between him and other people in the party? Just you wait till they've read Phil Rucker's story in the Washington Post. Because Failing to endorse
I know.
Paul Ryan, who's
I
endorsed
know.
Trump. Trump used virtually the same language that Ryan used when Ryan was hesitating about endorsing Trump. What is Reince Priebus going to say when Republicans say he's not trying to help Kelly AI?
The nominee is trying to blow the party up. There's no other way to interpret what's happening.
Amazing. Amazing day.
Out of control. All right. Now, moving on to lesser controversies, there is yet another one coming out of Donald Trump's mouth. His campaign's been trying to deal with today. Asked by USA Today's Kirsten Powers what his reaction would be if his daughter, Ivanka, was sexually harassed in the workplace, in particular if she were treated in the way that former Fox News CEO Roger Ailes has been accused of treating and behaving towards his female subordinates. Trump said this, quote, "I would like to think she would find another career or find another company if that was the case," end quote. Amid concerns that Trump was, at best, trivializing workplace harassment, another one of his children, Eric, tried to walk back or clarify, depending on your point of view, his father's comment during an interview on CBS this morning.
I think what he's saying is, Ivanka is a strong, powerful woman. She wouldn't allow herself to be, objected, to it. And by the way, you should certainly take it up with human resources. And I think, she definitely would as a strong person. At the same time, I don't think she would allow herself to be subjected to that. And I think that's the point he was making, and I think he did so well.
So, Mark, in the context of all else that is happening in this insane campaign of ours, is this particular problem that Trump brought upon himself today, is this a small problem, a medium-sized problem, or another gargantuan problem for Donald Trump?
I'd say medium today, but can grow. One of the things that has been, I think, little discussed is, yes, you see these broad messages and campaign ads and in surrogate activity.
Right.
And in Hillary Clinton's own comments. But eventually, and probably already underway, the Clinton campaign is going to micro-target. And you can bet that women will be getting those comments and will be, I think it's fair to say, Donald Trump's ability to win female votes is not going to be enhanced by this USA Today interview.
College-educated white women and men is a demographic that Republicans have dominated for 50 years. Hillary Clinton, according to our polling and others, is ahead with that demographic now. Suburban, college-educated white women hearing that, having that message driven deeply in the way you're talking about, micro-targeted, that's a problem he has to solve if he's going to win, and this hurts him with those people a lot.
Eric Trump talked about it. We saw that there. Ivanka has not, as far as I know.
Right.
Be fascinating to see what she thinks about what her father said.
Well, there's the tweet thing here, too. Also, you have Amanda Carpenter, conservative, who tweeted, "Strong women may flee sexual harassment, Eric Trump. Strong women may also fight, endure, and one day gain power to protect other women." And Eric Trump then retweeted that tweet and wrote, "I think this is well said, Amanda Carpenter." So he tried to clean up his dad's mess and made another mess of his own, and now is trying to clean up his cleanup effort.
Yes.
Things going real well for the Trump campaign.
That brings us to another topic, Trump surrogates. Eric Trump isn't the only person who's clarifying or trying to reframe controversial statements made by Donald J. Trump. In fact, Trump's family and his surrogates have become increasingly important players in the general election that so far has required a lot of translating of what the GOP candidate, quote, meant to say. Here are a few examples of the lines of defense from just the past 36 hours.
Every time I go on a TV show, it's to correct the record or to explain something that a journalist or the Democrats have taken out of context.
I was there at the DNC. I saw the speech. And again, let's start with this. I myself, the Trump campaign, Katrina, and Mr. Trump have utmost respect for Captain Khan, for his parents, for their loss, for their supreme sacrifice. So that is a baseline that we do not want to move off of.
Would it have been better if he'd emphasized that in his initial comments?
He is somebody who was attacked by Mr. Khan from the DNC.
Yeah.
And it was not that as it was a bipartisan speech.
Would your father be willing to apologize and move on?
I think that's a great question for him, and I think he has by calling them a hero. In terms of the one question, whether you've made a sacrifice, I think my father has. Now, that's certainly not the ultimate sacrifice. The ultimate sacrifice is a soldier dying for this nation and dying to protect the three of us. There's no question about it.
He didn't start the fight.
But he's still engaging in it.
This is the typical media. When Donald Trump responds to somebody, they say he's attacking. He's not. He's counterpunching.
Well, Donald Trump and I both have said that Captain Khan is an American hero. And we honor his service and his sacrifice, and we honor his family.
So, John, how effective is that surrogate operation in trying to help Trump's color within the lines? after he's already colored himself outside the lines.
There's a common phrase in politics about how you can't put lipstick on a pig, and what that means is you can't, spin the.
I think you say you can't put the lipstick back in the tube.
That's true too.
Once it's on the pig.
Hard to spin the unspinnable. And some of these surrogates are better, some of them are worse, just as performers. But they're given really difficult material to work with. But the more important thing, I think, is this: that Trump is such a huge figure. He's so big that most of his surrogates, who are largely unknown figures, it's just hard for them, even if they had material that was more spinnable, it would be hard for them to kind of correct for Trump, because he leaves such a large impression because of who he is.
Look, on the ground, locally, you're seeing probably more success from Mike Pence and others than the national framing would suggest. But, coming out of the convention, Mike Pence had some momentum. The Trump children for sure had some momentum. And I think one of the costs of Trump creating all these controversies, particularly the Khan fight, is that they can't do anything but play defense. The brand of Dom Jr., Eric, and Ivanka, and of Mike Pence is kind of dissipated now, because all they're doing is trying to clean up.
Right. Let's remember, a surrogate operation in an ideal world exists to try to amplify and push forward the messages you want to push forward. It shouldn't be just a defensive brigade at all times, and that's the position he's put them in. They're not making any positive arguments right now.
And they're all trying to go after Hillary Clinton. Eric this morning did what Paul Manafort and others have done, which is try to turn it to go after Hillary Clinton. And there's plenty to go after there. But the problem is the filter. This is not a case of liberal bias. The filter can only handle a few stories at a time, and Trump is creating the biggest stories through his errors.
And those efforts are just efforts to change the subject. And in the end, the subject is the subject.
Yeah.
All right. When we come back, Donald Trump dips into the old rig system rhetoric well. And later, we'll talk with Bill Rucker of the Washington Post about that incredible interview we just referenced with Donald Trump earlier today. We'll be right back with all that. Both of the vice presidential candidates have hit the campaign trail hard since their party's conventions, holding high-profile events across the country. After Tim Kaine's bus tour with Hillary Clinton over the weekend, Kaine held a hometown rally in Richmond, Virginia yesterday before heading to the battleground state of Florida today. On the Republican side, Mike Pence campaigned in Arizona this afternoon, but he spent yesterday in Nevada, where he got some pretty decent local news coverage on all 4 of the local affiliates in the Reno market. Here's a sampling of what that sounded like.
Pence made 2 stops in northern Nevada yesterday. He spoke at a rally at the GSR in Reno last night and also at a town hall event inside the Carson Nugget earlier in the day. Pence laid out his qualifications to be vice president.
Pence taking a question from a military mom, her question sparking boos from the audience.
The Indiana governor had a lot to say about our nation's soldiers and even addressed the controversy surrounding Captain Khan. Supporters at the rally say they appreciated the governor's time and attention that he gave to the U.S. military.
KOLO 8 News now spoke with several people who were at that speech. Many told us they hope Pence is able to smooth Trump's rough edges.
All right, Mark. So, Pence, Kaine, how they doing?
Well, they're laboring under some obscurity, which running mates always do after the conventions till their debate. And Pence, as we said before, is laboring under and have to do a lot of cleanup. I actually think they both are proving to be what the people who picked them thought they'd be, which is total pros, handling themselves with not a lot of infrastructure in a way that is very professional, very serviceable, driving message in local markets, as we saw with Pence.
I agree with that. I think they're both doing quite well. They are both kind of relatively bland on the scale of bland to spicy hot. But I keep watch Mike Pence going through all this, and I think to myself, my God, what is that man thinking as he tries to deal not just, I mean, he's got a kid in the military, he's dealing with the situation with Trump. He is saying the right things about the Khan controversy, but in the end, he can only do so much because of the fact that he's working for who he's working for.
Yeah, he's going to come under an extraordinary amount of pressure. He's in Arizona, supposedly meeting with John McCain today.
Right.
That'll be an interesting meeting, because I suspect Mike Pence supports John McCain in his primary. And Kaine is doing a good job as well. All right. By now, you've probably heard that Donald J. Trump, billionaire, has started repurposing his quote-unquote rigged system mantra for the general election. He mentioned the phrase only in passing today during his rally in Virginia, but yesterday afternoon in Ohio, Trump made the somewhat alarming statement that he was, quote, afraid that the election is going to be rigged in November. So, John, Trump talked about a rigged system to good effect for himself in the nomination fight. Is it going to be effective politically for him now to help him win rather than as a justification if he loses?
Well, no, again, in the realm of the unprecedented, the idea of a major party nominee suggesting somehow that the American election is somehow going to be a fraudulent affair.
Well, John Kerry worried about that in 2004.
I'm not saying they haven't worried about it. I'm saying they have not accused it.
Spent 3 months.
Yes, talking about it.
And
you worry about voting machines. You worry about voter suppression. You talk about those things, but you don't say, I think the system is somehow rigged by some higher forces.
Trump doesn't have a traditional turnout operation.
No.
I'm not saying it's a good idea saying it. In fact, I think it's a very bad idea for the country. But if he can scare people to the polls, if he can emotionally get them to go saying, we can't let them rig it, we need to win by so much that even a Clinton rigging won't keep us from winning, maybe he can scare some people to the polls. But again, I think it undermines what everyone running for president should want, which is confidence and faith in the system.
And look, and the honest to God truth is we both know what this is, which is that if Trump loses in November, there's no way he's going to be a gracious loser and say the American people have spoken, Hillary Clinton is now president.
I don't know why you think that.
He is going to want to have an excuse. And I think he may say this all the way to November so that especially if it's a close election, so he'll have stand up and be able to say, if it wasn't for this rigged system, I would have won. I just don't imagine, on the basis of anything we've seen, that Trump will be like a normal loser if he loses.
You're right.
Up next, we'll break down some new polling figures that figure out where Hillary Clinton's post-convention bounce is coming from. Also, the Washington Post's Phil Rucker will tell us about that amazing interview with Donald Trump today. So first, though, we got to listen to these words from our sponsors.
polls have been coming in quite fast and furious this week. Most of them are telling the same story. Hillary Clinton is getting a pretty solid bounce coming out of her Philadelphia convention. Today, there was a new survey from NBC News, SurveyMonkey. It shows Clinton leading Trump 50-42. Yesterday, we also talked about a new CNN poll showing Clinton beating Trump 52-43. We're going to take a deeper dive now into these numbers with our chief pollster, Ann Selzer, who joins us now from Des Moines. So, Ann, it seems pretty clear that Clinton has gotten some edge out of her convention. Let's talk about independents first. What has happened to independents in these surveys over pre- and post-convention?
Well, there's one of the things that you want a convention to do for you is to not just solidify your base, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also to bring in new people, to convince those that might have been straddling the fence to come on board and join the party. We've got two CNN polls to take a look at, one that was conducted before the Democratic convention and one conducted after. Same methodology, so it gives us a really good confidence that we're looking at real change. The poll that CNN published in July showed Trump leading by 15 points. The poll published after the Democratic convention had Hillary Clinton up by 7 points. So those independents either kind of were loosely affiliated with Trump or had not really chosen a candidate yet. What they saw at the convention for now appears to have made them decide, more of them, to decide to join the Hillary Clinton camp.
And let's talk about gender. Looking at these numbers, what do you see when it comes to the breakdown between men and women?
Well, one of the other things that convention needs to do is help you shore up your base. And women who tend to vote Democratic, and then you've got the woman card, shall we say, that Hillary Clinton wanted to play up at the convention. She's up 10 points with women. She now has a strong majority of 57% saying that they are supporting Hillary Clinton. She's also up with men by 6 points. Now, she didn't pull those men over from Trump. He stayed steady, interestingly enough, in those two polls at 50%. So it was more those undecided or perhaps looking at a different party who decided they'd seen what they needed to, for now, say that Hillary Clinton is their candidate.
And before and after the conventions, Clinton obviously had an advantage with non-white voters, as Democrats do. But has that changed at all to account for any of her increase?
It has changed indeed, and it has changed in her favor. She is up 14 points with the non-white voter. That brings her to 80%. That is a stratospheric number, which must mean, by the complementary rule, that Donald Trump's number is really, really lagging. He now gets 12% of the non-white vote. That's down several percentage points for him. So that's the part of the electorate that is the fastest growing. It's the one that the Republicans talked about after 2012 as where they really needed to focus. Donald Trump is moving in the wrong direction with that group.
So, Ann, in the history of bounces, how often are they enduring and how often do they settle back down?
You know, it is so different from convention to convention, candidate to candidate. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about Newton's laws of physics. One is, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So you would expect from a bounce that things, by the elasticity, is going to bring it back into some sort of main place where it's just kind of settled, kind of its homeostasis point. But I think what you've got to take a look at now, I'm giving a physics lecture now, is what happens with the campaigns next. You have August, where it tends to not be an active campaign month, and really things rev up after Labor Day. You'd have to think that the Clinton campaign, with the resources that it has, may think it can win this thing in August, given that they've got the resources, given that Trump is having kind of daily difficulties. I'm especially curious what the campaign tees up in August.
Okay, Ann Selzer in Des Moines, Iowa. Ann, thank you very much. Coming up, we're going to talk more about Donald Trump's extraordinary interview with the Washington Post and this big day in his relationship with the Republican Party right after this.
We are joined now from Washington by the Washington Post reporter with the big Trump interview today. That will be Phil Rucker. Phil, tell us what happened when you got to see Donald Trump. You've been banned for a while before this interview.
We have been. Well, I was at his rally earlier today, and he had me over at the golf course in Northern Virginia, and we had lunch and talked for a while about a range of subjects. But the newsiest might be his announcement that he's not yet ready to endorse Paul Ryan, the House Speaker. He's the top-ranked Republican in Washington. He's in a primary challenge, Republican primary in Wisconsin. That election is on Tuesday of next week, and Trump said, quote, "I'm just not there yet," in terms of endorsing Ryan. He also complimented Paul Ryan's primary opponent. So this is a pretty extraordinary breach of sort of party unity and expected decorum in these circumstances, and I think underscores just how divided the Republican Party is right now.
Phil, did he come into the interview, you think, fixing to say this stuff, or were you pressing him on it?
I pressed him on it. I actually asked him about a tweet that he made last night where he complimented Ryan's opponent and just said, look, can you explain what's going on here? Are you endorsing the opponent? Are you endorsing Paul Ryan? Where do you stand? And he just said that he's giving an endorsement of Ryan serious consideration, but that he's not there yet. And he repeated that point several times in the interview. He left no doubt that that's where he stood. He's simply not ready to endorse Ryan.
Phil, we want to bring in Katy of NBC News in a minute, but just in one or two words, what was his tone in talking about Ryan, McCain, and Kelly Ayotte?
You know, I think he feels like he's the Republican nominee here. He's in charge of the party, and he's very upset that these people are not in lockstep behind him. He criticized McCain. He criticized Ayotte. Of course, both of them came out with statements criticizing Trump over the last few days over his treatment of the Khan family. But Trump feels like he's in charge. It's his party, and these people need to get in line behind him.
Katy, just playing off of what Phil just said a second ago there, it would seem to me and to anybody who's ever covered a presidential campaign that given everything that's happened over the course of the last 96 hours or so, this would be a campaign in utter meltdown, just complete crisis. What does it feel like to you as you watch them move through the day?
You know, it doesn't feel like utter meltdown. I just had a conversation with one of Trump's aides, and they were pretty calm. I think the state of controversy that this campaign has been in has become the norm for this campaign. It's rolling with Donald Trump's whims and rolling with what he said. Was this a calculated move? I think that Phil pressing him means that it was not. But I would point out that, guys, in the past 2 weeks, there's been 5 different Donald Trump controversies. There was the Melania controversy over her speech, the plagiarism, excuse me. There was Donald Trump fighting with Ted Cruz again linking his father to the assassination of JFK. And then Donald Trump and Russia, Donald Trump fighting with the Khans, and those controversies, those last 2, were not going away. And so what is going on now? Donald Trump is talking about maybe not endorsing Paul Ryan. He extinguishes one controversy with the next. This is how he has operated. And when you talk to people about why he would do this, well, they say he does this because he doesn't have to talk about policy. He's talking about controversies. He's responding. He's in his comfort zone, which is being himself, not necessarily going in and talking about a fleshed out idea about how he would fix the education system in this country, or how he would reform the tax plan further to what he's already said, or how he would actually beat ISIS.
Phil, did he seem at all distracted by or concerned with the Khan controversy when you talked to him?
He did not. We talked about the Khans briefly in the interview, and he basically repeated what he's been saying the last few days, which is that, in his view, he was viciously attacked on the stage at the Democratic National Convention by Mr. Khan, and that he has every right to respond in the way that he did. I'll say during the interview, he was sort of watching himself on Fox News across the room on the TV and was pretty impressed with the statement he put out responding to Obama and how much attention that was getting on Fox News. Look, he's like Katy said, he's rolling with the punches. He's trying to take this campaign 1 hour at a time. And I think he gave me a frank answer about Paul Ryan, which is that, you know, he has not endorsed Ryan. He's not ready to do so. And, you know, he actually said he thinks, you know, he likes Paul Ryan, but he thinks the country needs strong leaders because we're in dangerous times. So he's clearly not on board.
Katy, the Khan controversy, as you pointed out, is not going away. And President Obama, his statement, obviously, as we were talking about on the show earlier today, trying to drive a wedge between Trump and the Republican Party. Does Trump get that, you know, with a Republican who said he's the first one who's moved away from him, said he's going to vote for Hillary Clinton, with all these things, the defections and the stress, does he fear the possibility that the party may just now come apart at the seams?
No, I don't think he does. I think Donald Trump sees this as his party, not Paul Ryan's party, not the Republican leadership. I remember back in May when he was in West Virginia and Paul Ryan was saying he wasn't ready to endorse Donald Trump shot back that he wasn't ready to endorse Paul Ryan's agenda. And I spoke to Corey Lewandowski, who was the campaign manager at that time, and he told me very frankly, this is not Paul Ryan's party. This is Donald Trump's party. He is the leader of the Republican Party. And that is how Donald Trump has been operating since day one. And the fact that he has won the primaries, he feels there's a mandate, and his rhetoric and his ideas are what is leading this party forward, not necessarily the leadership in Washington. Remember, when you talk to Republican voters and the ones who decided that Donald Trump was going to be their flag carrier, that they didn't like what was going on in Washington. They didn't believe that the people that they voted into power there were doing a good job. They didn't believe that they were representing them. So Donald Trump does have that on his side. That's not the entirety of the Republican Party. He did get a plurality of the Republican Party to get this nomination. The thing with Donald Trump, though, is that he's going to have to expand that out and find independent voters. And do independent voters find him appealing if he's fighting with everybody? And that does include the Republican Party. I'm not so sure it does.
Phil, we talked about Trump's comments on McCain and Ryan and Kelly Ayotte, and you said briefly about the cons. We'll all be refreshing WashingtonPost.com obsessively, but tell us what other topics you covered with him.
We covered a range of topics, and we're going to be publishing more of the interview later into the evening. We talked about the sexual harassment issue. He brought this up the other day regarding his daughter, Ivanka. And we talked about the debates. You know, he wants to negotiate these debates, and so he laid out a little bit of what he hopes to happen there and some of the
Can you give us a little preview of that, of what kind of things he said about the debates?
I will tell you, he says he absolutely thinks the debate should be a head-to-head with Hillary Clinton only, that Jill Stein and the Libertarian candidate should not qualify for the debate stage, so he feels pretty strongly about
regardless of whether they get to 15% or not?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's big news.
It should be head-to-head.
That's big news you got there, fella.
And Phil, do you think he wants, does he want 3 debates, or does he want fewer, from what you can tell?
He wants to negotiate this debate schedule on the best terms possible for himself. He feels like he was able to have an influence in negotiating the debates during the primaries, and plans to try to do that here. He doesn't think these should be up against NFL games or the World Series or any other major competing televised event.
Katy Tur, he kicked a baby out of his event today. How'd that go over with the crowd?
He was joking. I mean, this is coming on the... He was joking, guys. The baby was crying, and he stopped mid-sentence and said he loves babies, and he went on, and a moment later, he said, get that baby out of here. It was very clear that he was joking, and there were a number of mothers with babies there. No, the baby stayed.
Oh, the baby stayed.
I was there, too. It was a joke. It was definitely a joke.
The baby stayed. Well,
sometimes those jokes don't translate to television, but that was very clearly just a colorful aside.
Donald Trump, the only candidate I've ever heard of who would even risk making a joke about kicking a baby out of an event. Phil Rucker, Katy Tur, thank you guys for
congratulations, Phil.
Phil, killing it today. Up next, we got John Dickerson of CBS News and the Washington Post, Dan Balz, when we come back.
Two political heavyweights join us now. Ironically, they're both very thin in a good way. On the screen in one corner, the Washington Post chief correspondent, Dan Balz, and here in another corner here in our studio, the host of CBS Face the Nation, John Dickerson. He's got a new book out that we're going to talk about in the next segment. It's called Whistle Stop, My Favorite Stories from Presidential Campaign History. We will get to that, but John, let's start with today's news. It's common to say something happened with Donald Trump. It's the biggest, it's unprecedented, never happened. Today, with both President Obama going after him and his statements about Paul Ryan and John McCain, you ever seen anything like this in the general election?
I can't think of it. I mean, the president's been saying unfit, been trying to drive this wedge between Obama and the Republicans. Obama and conservatives, has been trying to draw these wedges as he did in his convention speech. But then basically Donald Trump is fighting a two-front war between his own party and the president, all related to this question of temperament. Is he fit for the job? Which you could say is a trap that Democrats set for him, except that when you talk to the Trump campaign, they say the key threshold is whether people will see that he has the temperament and judgment for the job.
Right. Dan, you know Paul Ryan and John McCain pretty well. How do you think they're going to react to Donald Trump unwillingness to endorse them in the month of their contested primaries?
Mark, privately they have to be furious about it. Publicly, I have no idea how they're going to do it, because they have managed over the course of several months to try to put some distance between themselves and things that Donald Trump has said and done without actually repudiating him outright. And so I think he's put him in a terrible position, and I'm frankly curious to know how they are going to respond.
Dan, don't you think you make this point, they've repudiated him at various times but not withdrawn their endorsement. Isn't the obvious next step here that they are going to have to doesn't it feel like Trump is daring them in some ways to just abandon him completely and withdraw their endorsements?
Well, in some way or another, he seems to be doing that, although I'm not sure that that's exactly what he's doing. I think he's baiting them a little bit. I think he's taunting them a little bit. But I don't know whether that's his ultimate goal, to force them to repudiate him. I'm not sure that serves him in any specific way to try to win the presidency. But he's a person that you're either with him or he's against you. Yeah. and we've seen another example of that today.
The Khan controversy, everyone agrees, is kind of different, maybe, qualitatively from other past controversies. It has now opened the door to discussions of Donald Trump's military non-service. The discussion today about when he wore the guy's Purple Heart. Just how long-term dangerous do you think the Khan issue and all the doors it's opening are to Trump?
Well, I think dangerous in this sense, which is that Republicans have been concerned about the volatility of Donald Trump and the unpredictability in a political context ever since he came on the scene. When he picked Mike Pence, the thing that Republicans were saying to me at the convention, they kept using the word stabilize. And that was, they were worried about this volatility and Mike Pence was going to stabilize him. There is no stability. And the Khan controversy and then the controversies that attach to it and the kind of you're all over the map feeling, the number of days to the election are counting down. So you got to get things in line for the presidential, but also for their futures, for their campaigns. Now they're all having to respond to the daily explosions, and that's what worries Republicans.
You've had a top aide to Chris Christie, a top aide to Jeb Bush, and now a retiring Republican congressman all say they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton and not for Donald Trump. Is that open the floodgates, or do you think most everybody else will stand in place?
I don't think it opens the floodgates. Oh, sorry, Dan.
John first and then Dan.
I don't think it opens the floodgates. I think what it does is it gives those Republicans who are curious about, who were worried about Donald Trump, it represents their feeling. I mean, regular voters. I don't think they're looking at what Sally Bradshaw does down in Florida, the Jeb Bush staffer, but I think it's representative of a feeling we see in the larger electorate with those college-educated white voters that he's having such trouble.
And Dan, before you answer, I just want to clarify. Sally Bradshaw said she'd only vote for Hillary Clinton if the race in Florida was close, but she's not voting for Trump.
Right. Well, here's the way one could think about this, which is that these are people who are part of the political establishment, the political elite, if you will. They've been in high campaign positions for other Republicans who tried to take Donald Trump down. Trump's path to the presidency, put aside the electoral map question and the geographic path, Trump's path to the presidency is to rally an anti-establishment electorate in this country to make it as big and as boisterous as he possibly can. And so every time he kind of, pokes the establishment in the eye, as he has been doing, conceivably helps him try to do that. I'm not convinced that that's the case, but he, I think he knows kind of what he is trying to do and where his constituency is, and his constituency is not that of the party elites or the party regulars.
So there's no doubt that Dan is right and that Trump is rallying an anti-establishment electorate. Does the electorate look at the military as part of the establishment? Because one of the most striking things in the last few days has been these retired military officers and others coming forward and denouncing Trump for the Khan controversy. And we all know people who are in the military, out of the military, foreign policy people who right now are never going to vote for Trump. The only question is how public they're going to be, or are they going to vote for Clinton?
Right. I think it gets back to this is too dangerous to be president problem that for him, and that's something that the Clinton people were going to talk about regardless, and he's just giving evidence to that argument. And when military officials speak, or former military, they speak with a weight, and they are outside of the political system. And I think that's a charismatic voice in this conversation. It's not just left or right.
Dan, let me ask you this. Lots going wrong with the Trump campaign right now, according to Republicans, Democrats, journalists alike. Is there anything going on with the Trump campaign right now that's not getting sufficient attention, that's going well?
Not that is very visible at this point. There's nothing that we can see that would suggest things are going well. I mean, Donald Trump is still the captain of the ship, and he's steering it in the directions he wants to go. I mean, he had an opportunity, given the lousy growth numbers that came out on Friday, to begin to kind of trample on Hillary Clinton's convention and to suppress her bounce. He chose to do just the opposite, which is to help her over the last several days, and he continues to do that. And now, in this interview that he did with Phil Rucker this afternoon, roiling up his own party to cause further controversy. So I would say at this point, it's not clear that there's anything essential that's going right in his campaign.
Okay, as we say here on the set, though, tomorrow is another day. Dan Balz, thank you very much. We're holding John Dickerson behind for story time with John on his book on the election, American history, right after this.
Back with our old friend John Dickerson, the host of CBS's Face the Nation and author of a new book out today called Whistle Stop, My Favorite Stories from Presidential Campaign History. John, thanks for sticking around. There are an incredible array of good stories in this book. It's a rollicking, page-turning, fun, fantastic read. What's the most relevant story in the book to understanding what's happening in 2016?
Oh, you got to go to Wallace in '68, just because Wallace tapped into an anger and a disappointment with regular blue-collar workers and the elites, and got really at the crux of it, which was that the fancy pants elites makes all these decisions that you pay for, and we're not going to stand for it anymore. And I feel like that is a very similar sentiment. Then, of course, you get the idea that Wallace was basically, the voters always said he speaks his mind. There was this sense that, Wallace said something other people weren't, and that just feels like the most echoes. But there are lots of them in here.
You get into one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of presidential politics. Ed Muskie up in New Hampshire, outside the Union leader, denouncing the Union leader. Snow on his face or tears out of his eyes?
I think tears, but not the burbling mess that he was written about. So he gets this flatbed truck, calls all the reporters in. It's snowing. He's got a little doily of snow in his hair. He starts talking about his wife. That's the key. So there's the Canuck letter, the accusation that he used a slur in an event, but what gets him undone is he's talking about his wife in an editorial that ran on the front page of the Union leader, which makes fun of her. She'd sacrificed a lot for him to run. He gets emotional, but one of the accounts has him being like a face full of tears. Watching the video, you know it's not a face full of tears, but that account took off, and that was it in terms of basically everybody thinking he was in tears.
You write about Goldwater in this book, and obviously some people hope and some people fear that Trump will be the Goldwater for the Republican Party this time around. Just tell us about Barry Goldwater and what you write in the book.
Well, Goldwater was an ideological movement in a way that Trump isn't, but there was a Stop Goldwater movement that was much more robust than the Never Trump movement. You had 19 Republican governors trying to stop Goldwater, and they still couldn't do it. And I think Nixon's line at the end of this is the best when he tells Buchanan, if there is ever a Stop X movement, you want to be with X, because it means they're doing well enough, they've got the people behind them, that they're going to prevail in this fight. But when you hear Governor Rockefeller speak at the '64 convention and get booed, it feels very similar to what happened to Ted Cruz in this last Republican convention. So another parallel.
Another great story about JFK. Obviously incredibly gifted political athlete. As a Catholic going into West Virginia and trying to win over people in West Virginia as a Brahmin Catholic.
Yeah, he's furious that all of us at the time, or the versions of us at the time, say his win in Wisconsin was just a Catholic win. In other words, he's trying to build up his credentials by winning in these primaries, and suddenly it's written off as just a religious thing. So he goes to West Virginia. There's only 5% of the state that's Catholics. Teddy White has a quote from a woman who said, of course Catholics shouldn't be president. If they did, it would be in the Constitution. He runs from it at first, and then he realizes that isn't working. So he starts to run television ads and talk about it all the time, and basically just grab the issue by the throat and just take it on head on. Ends up winning in West Virginia, a fight he didn't want to have. But when he wins in West Virginia, he's allowed to say, look, I went into a state where they didn't like me, and they didn't like me because I was a Catholic, and I still won. The issue's dead. It wasn't quite dead, but that helped him pretend it was, at least for the purposes of the Democratic
big symbolic
convention. Right?
Mark talks about an enduring mystery. I'll ask you about another one, which is one of the great photo ops ever that went awry. Mike Dukakis in the tank. Why was he in that tank? He was that Rocky and Bullwinkle out there.
He was in the tank because the Bush campaign had been about a systematic effort to tear him down, going point by point by point. He wasn't patriotic. He was too weak. He was a far-left, card-carrying member of the ACLU, and this was an attempt to build up his bona fides as a national security candidate. He gave a big speech on national security that day that was thoughtful, had lots of good ideas in it, but the picture was supposed to match with that. They were going to take the photo op without the helmet on, in the tank, standing there in the M1 Abrams tank, and the problem was that when the tank was moving, he had to wear the helmet. Given the photo op with the helmet off or the photo op with the helmet on, everybody went with the helmet on, and it made it look like somebody who wasn't comfortable in his own skin, somebody who was doing something just for the show. There was a big manhood fight in that campaign because, as you both remember, the cover of Newsweek magazine, the Wimp Factor with George W. Bush, both candidates were trying to prove they were men who could handle the office.
John Dickerson, thank you so much. His new book, and it is an incredible book. You got to buy it. It's called Whistle Stop, and it's available now. Let's push him up to #1 on Amazon. You can also listen to John's show, Face the Nation, on Bloomberg Radio in New York and Washington on Sundays at 2 p.m. You got to do that, too. And while you're at it, you can listen to this program every night on the radio in Washington, D.C. on 99.1 FM. We'll be right back. We have some advice for Donald Trump before we go. For your next in-flight meal, go ahead and lose the fork. You don't need it for chicken.
Head to BloombergPolitics.com right now. Check out the latest on what Donald Trump has said today about America's infrastructure. Coming up on Bloomberg West. Until tomorrow, sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of First Word News. A new NBC News SurveyMonkey poll has Hillary Clinton leading Donald Trump 50% to 42%. Speaking today in Virginia, Mr. Trump questioned the results of some recent surveys.
I think we're going to do so great, and I see some great polls. I see one from Los Angeles Times, just came out, where we're ahead by 4 or 5 points. I see one from CNN where we're down. I think these polls, I don't know, there's something about these polls, there's something phony.
In a sign of continuing dissension within the GOP, Trump said today he's not ready to endorse House Speaker Paul Ryan or Senators John McCain and Kelly Ayotte. New York Congressman Richard Hanna is the first Republican House member to announce support for Hillary Clinton. In an op-ed published on Syracuse.com, Hanna, who's retiring at the end of the year, writes that Donald Trump is, quote, unfit to serve our party and cannot lead this country. Italy says it will evaluate any U.S. request to allow use of a Sicilian air base to launch airstrikes against an Islamic State stronghold in Libya. Italy agreed in February to let armed U.S. drones take off from Sigonella Base, but only to defend American forces targeting extremists. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton.
And this is Bloomberg West. Coming up, Etsy, EA, Fitbit, the latest in the tech earnings parade. Fitbit shares popping after hours on signs a new line of trackers may be gaining traction. Plus, the tech mega mergers keep rolling in. We'll speak to a veteran Valley dealmaker about which shoes are still left to drop. And Instagram takes a page, or maybe a whole chapter, from the Snapchat playbook. Are the latest product changes enough to take on the disappearing competition? First, to our lead. Investors liking both Fitbit and Etsy post-earnings. Shares of Fitbit surging as much as 8% after hours. Revenue for the wearables company growing 46% to $586 million from a year earlier, suggesting new fitness trackers are getting a leg up. Etsy shares also enjoying an after-hours boost, popping as much as 6%. Gross merchandise sales, the value of the goods that passed through Etsy's platform increased 23% from a year earlier to $670 million. So are things turning around for the two stock market rookies that went public last year? Here with me to digest, our editor-at-large, Corey Johnson, Roger McNamee, co-founder of Elevation Partners and my guest host for the hour, and from LA, Wedbush Securities Managing Director, Gil Luria, who covers Etsy. So, Gil, I'll start with you on Etsy. Pull out the highlights for me and why things seem to be looking up for this company.
Well, I think it's a lot of matter of expectations. After the IPO, they set expectations that were way too high and then under-delivered. Early this year, they set up expectations that are very reasonable, and they've been exceeding those expectations. That GMS growth number you talked about was actually a slight acceleration. Revenue accelerated. The real takeaway here is that e-commerce is accelerating. We saw it with Amazon, we saw it with eBay, and Etsy's just the latest. People are buying more and more online at an accelerated rate.
Interesting. We also had a note out from an analyst at Citigroup saying it's unfair to compare Etsy to Amazon. Amazon has its own division called Handmade, an attempt to sort of take on Etsy. Roger, what do you think of Etsy? I mean, you know, is there any comparison?
I'm just a big believer that the marketplace, when you get enough people in it, develops a life of its own, and things don't compete exactly. People develop cultures. eBay developed a very early culture, which remains to this day. Etsy's developed its own. The issue that these guys face, I think, is much less related to competition than it is just to the activity of the members of that community.
Right.
Are they doing things? Is that community growing? Are there ways to ingest more energy into the community? And for Etsy, you know, time will tell. It's not a huge marketplace, but there are certain things. When you want a giant ball of yarn, there is really nowhere else to look except for Etsy. And it's weird because today, for a weird reason, I was looking for a giant ball of yarn.
Oh,
and it was my
really?
first stop. And it turns out that they offer a lot of giant balls of yarn.
I've gone there for birthday signs, pillows in every shape and color, but the problem is that I don't go back to the same retailer, the same shop.
No, clearly. I mean, in all those marketplace things, the marketplace develops all the brand value, right? It's really hard to break out of that. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe the value really is in aggregating everything.
Right.
And if you're making large balls of yarn, I mean, my sense is Etsy, even if it's not promoting you for a second and third sale, getting the first one is a really big deal. And I think that's really what the value of the brand is.
Gil, how well is Etsy doing when it comes to building relationships between buyers and sellers and increasing the stickiness of the platform so that these purchases aren't just one-offs?
Actually, that is the blemish. Even in this quarter, the rate of net additions to their sellers is continuing to decline. It declined for the fourth quarter in a row. Those sellers are realizing that maybe it's better to just have their own storefront and are going to Shopify and opening their own store because they realize what they're really doing is renting customers from Etsy. So that's the little bit of a caveat in the quarter, is that the rate of net seller additions is still declining. It's been declining for 4 quarters in a row.
I want to turn now to Fitbit, another company that went public last year and has had a bit of a rough go since its debut on the public markets. Corey, you've been diving into Fitbit. We're seeing some traction with the new line of fitness trackers. What would you pull out here?
Yeah, so on the call, or in the press release even, they talked about how the Fitbit Blaze, which is a watch, and their new Ultra are doing quite well over 50% of sales. But it was an interesting quarter, and initially Wall Street's reaction was completely confused about this. If you go to the Bloomberg and you look at the trading of the stock right after the numbers were announced, stock falls immediately because investors may have looked at the gross margin number. The gross margin number was really weak. How weak? Well, let me share this gross margin number, how it changed. First, let's look at the after-hours trading of the stock, which you can see here. This is me doing my weatherman. You missed me looking for flying squirrels for sale on Etsy. They have flying taxidermied squirrels on Etsy. And Roger, if you can't find your ball of yarn, I strongly suggest you look there. But if you want a Fitbit, you might have thought you were paying less for it. Initially, the market sells off big. You can see the trading go down substantially for this company right after they announced earnings. Then the stock pops right back up as people started to read it. But the gross margin number was a concern. Gross margin is coming down quite a bit into this quarter, down, all the way. If you look back a few quarters, you look at numbers that were like 54, 55%. This quarter, all the way down to 41.8%, a substantial change. Well, what's the change? They decided to take a charge against really the cost of sales, put aside more money for potential warranties, and as a result, they said for this one quarter, that charge is going to reduce gross margin. So it wasn't really about the product being a lot more expensive to manufacture. It was that additional warranties taken aside, a conservative measure by this company. Now, the way that the warranties are being used, that is how many actual returns they get, those numbers have always been less than the money put aside with the exception of the Fitbit Force, which is a total recall. But this one in particular, this quarter, they're putting aside a bigger reserve, a rainy day fund, if you will, for warranties, and putting that aside. Now, they'll explain that in the quarterly number exactly how much they're putting aside and how much the returns were. We don't know that. I don't know if they're going to say anything on the call about it. But I think that was some of the initial confusion for the stock afterwards. I think this company, by my looking at it, does a pretty good job of actually disclosing those numbers and talking about how they're putting money aside for warranties, so it doesn't surprise investors as it did right before their IPO when they had a massive product problem and a total recall of one product.
Roger, you've been nodding along here. Fitbit's been trying to transform itself into a digital health company. They're spending more on R&D. At the same time, they're competing with Apple. They're competing with Xiaomi in a wearables market that is still fairly nascent. What do you think about Fitbit's prospects?
McNamee's first law of tech investing is that product cycles are the only cycles that matter. You can ignore the economy, you can ignore everything else for most tech businesses, and Fitbit is a perfect example of this. My impression is that the watch in particular is a really interesting product. And again, Fitbit has done a brilliant job, in my opinion, of establishing a beachhead underneath Apple. They really have